There are memories that settle deep into your bones, no matter how much you try to bury them. This is one of those stories. It was the fall of 1989, and I was 22 years old. My friends and I decided to escape the stress of college life and head out to Jasper Ridge, Colorado. If you haven't heard of it, that wouldn't blame you. It's a remote town tucked away in the Rocky Mountains, barely a dot on the map. Back then, fewer than 1,000 people lived there, and it felt like a place forgotten by time. No chain stores, no big highways, just winding roads, wooden signs, and the kind of quiet that gets under your skin. The town was breathtaking. Pines stretched endlessly into the sky, their tops swaying gently in the wind. Snow dusted the mountain peaks, even in the early days of autumn. From the main road, you could see a blanket of mist rolling over the forest, like it was guarding something. It was the kind of place where you feel both awestruck and uneasy at the same time. We had rented a cabin about 6 miles out of town, deep in the woods. I remember thinking how perfect it looked when we pulled up. It was perched on a hill, weathered but still standing strong, as if it had been there forever. The roof sagged in places, and the paint was peeling, but it had charm. At least, that's what we thought at the time. It was the kind of cabin you'd expect to find in a postcard, with a stone chimney and a small porch that creaked with every step. The view stretched out over the forest below, endless and untouched. There was something about the air out there. It wasn't just the altitude. It was heavier, colder than it should have been for September. The silence was different too. Back home, you could hear birds, squirrels, the hum of distant cars. Here, it was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Even my friend Christy, who was usually the first to cry out, stayed quiet as we unloaded the car. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of it all. By the time we settled in, the sun was already dipping below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and orange. It should have been peaceful. It should have been the start of a relaxing weekend, but as I stood on the porch looking out at the tree line, a chill ran down my spine. The shadows seemed deeper, like they stretched out further than they should. I shook it off and went inside, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. What none of us realized was that our weekend away was about to become something we'd never forget, and not for the reasons we'd hoped. We reached the cabin just as the last streaks of daylight slipped away. The drive up the gravel path had been rough, the kind that jostled the car and made you wonder if you'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But there it was, exactly as the rental listing had described. A cabin perched on a small hill, surrounded by towering pines. The place had clearly seen better days. The porch sagged in places, and the shutters hung crookedly like they'd been battered by years of harsh winters. The wood was gray and weathered, and patches of moss clung stubbornly to the corners. Yet there was something oddly inviting about it. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. It was isolated enough to feel like an escape, but not so far from town that it felt unsafe. Mike, always the practical one, made a joke about the place being rustic charm meets haunted house. Christy, who had a knack for finding humor in any situation, laughed and made a dramatic gesture about the lack of cell service. Daniel didn't say much. He just stared at the tree line, his expression unreadable. As we carried our bags inside, I couldn't shake the sensation that the air was wrong. It wasn't just the smell of damp wood or the faint mustiness of a place that hadn't been aired out in a while. It felt thicker somehow, like it was pressing down on us. I didn't mention it, thinking it was just nerves. The inside of the cabin was no better. The furniture was outdated, the kind you'd expect to find at a thrift store. Stiff, floral-patterned couches and a heavy wooden dining table scarred with years of use. The floors creaked with every step, and the windows were smudged, as if someone had wiped them half-heartedly years ago. That night, we lit a fire in the stone hearth and settled in, trying to make the best of it. Mike pulled out a deck of cards, Sarah poured some wine, and for a while, it almost felt normal. But as the night wore on, the unease crept back in. Every time I glanced out the window, I felt as though the darkness beyond the glass was watching. The next morning, Christy was the first one up. I found her standing on the porch, staring at the ground. Her face was pale, her usual easygoing demeanor gone. "Come look at this," she said, her voice tight. In the dirt just beyond the steps was a single footprint. It was massive, easily twice the size of any human foot, and unlike anything I'd ever seen. The toes were long and clawed, and the edges of the print were sharp, as though whatever made it had stepped with deliberate force. Mike squatted down to get a better look, running his fingers lightly over the impression. "Bear?" he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "No bear leaves a print like that," Christy replied. She was right. It didn't look natural. It looked purposeful. Daniel, trying to lighten the mood, joked about it being a prank. "Probably some local trying to scare the city folk," he said. But even he didn't sound convinced. I didn't say anything, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't just the size or the shape of the footprint, it was the placement. There was only one, perfectly formed, with no trail leading to or away from it. It felt like it had been left there as a message. That night, the cabin came alive in ways none of us expected. It started with small things, creaks and groans we tried to chalk up to the old wood settling. But then, the front door, which we had locked before bed, swung open with a slow, deliberate creak around midnight. Christy was the first to notice. She shook me awake, her eyes wide with fear. "The door," she whispered. "I locked it. I know I did." Mike got up to check, muttering something about the wind, but there was no wind. The air outside was still. Later, Christy swore she heard faint whispers coming from the forest. She described them as soft, almost melodic, but with an edge that made her skin crawl. I wanted to believe she was imagining things, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. The next morning, Daniel woke up with scratches running down his forearm. They weren't deep, but they were too precise to be accidental. He brushed it off, saying he must have scratched himself in his sleep, but the look in his eyes told a different story. Each of us felt it now, that heavy, invisible presence that seemed to lurk just beyond the edges of the cabin. Whatever had left that footprint wasn't gone. It was waiting. The second night, the air inside the cabin felt stifling, almost too quiet. Even the crackling of the fire seemed subdued. None of us wanted to admit it, but the tension between us was growing. We were all on edge, jumping at the slightest noise. Around midnight, the silence outside was broken by heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were slow and methodical, crunching the leaves and snapping twigs as they circled the cabin. I sat frozen, gripping the armrest of the couch as the sound grew closer, then fainter, then closer again, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. "It's just an animal," Mike whispered, though his voice betrayed his fear. Christy wasn't buying it. "No animal walks like that," she shot back. I grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Mike to do the same. Together we shone the beams out the windows, scanning the darkness. But the light hit nothing. No movement, no shadows, just the dense, unyielding forest. Yet the footsteps continued, steady and deliberate. I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't just heavy. It was unnatural, almost hollow, as though the ground itself recoiled with each step. We lost sleep that night. When dawn finally came, none of us dared to step outside until the sun was fully up. The first thing we saw when we did was a new set of footprints. They were just like the one from the morning before, massive, clawed, and impossibly deep. But this time, there were more of them, leading from the porch into the forest. The strangest part? They stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had disappeared into thin air. What? How does that even happen? Christy asked, her voice trembling. She knelt near the last print and recoiled, covering her nose. Do you smell that? I crouched beside her and caught it immediately, a metallic, almost coppery stench, like rust or blood. It was faint but distinct, hanging in the cold morning air. Mike tried to laugh it off. Probably some old animal track and minerals in the soil, he stammered. No one responded. We all knew it wasn't that simple. That evening, we stayed close together in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a board game, but the tension was suffocating, and even the smallest noises outside made us jump. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint crackle of the dying fire. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the cabin. It was low and resonant, a sound that felt more felt than heard, as though it was coming from the very walls. We need to leave, Christy whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. As I turned toward the window, I saw it, a shadowy figure, taller than any person I'd ever seen, standing just beyond the glass. Its outline was massive, its shoulders broad, and its head grotesquely shaped, almost inhuman. Then its eyes appeared, glowing, piercing red. They locked onto mine, and for a split second I couldn't breathe. Mike shouted something, breaking the trance, and I turned away. When I looked back, the figure was gone. We didn't wait. Grabbing only what we could carry, we bolted from the cabin, heading for the car parked down the hill. The forest seemed different now, darker and more alive. The trees groaned and creaked as though they were shifting, and the whispers Christy had heard the night before were now audible to all of us. They came from every direction, faint but unmistakable. I could barely make out words, but what I heard chilled me. My name, repeated softly, over and over. Keep moving, Mike shouted, but Daniel stumbled, crashing to the ground. He screamed, clutching his ankle. It grabbed me, he yelled, his voice raw with panic. I turned to help him up, but there was nothing there. No hand, no claw marks, just the impression of something heavy pressed into the dirt around him, as though something unseen had pinned him down. It felt like the forest itself was working against us, the branches clawing at our clothes, the ground shifting under our feet. By the time we reached the car, we were gasping for air, but we didn't stop. We didn't waste a second fumbling for keys, but as I grabbed the door handle, I froze. Deep, jagged claw marks ran across the driver's side, their edges raw and splintered, as if they'd been freshly carved into the metal. Christy let out a choked gasp, stepping back. Mike swore under his breath, his hands trembling as he yanked the door open. "Get in!" he shouted, his voice cracking. We piled into the car in a chaotic rush, slamming the doors behind us. The interior was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the air felt thin, like the vehicle itself was struggling to protect us. Just as Mike turned the key in the ignition, something massive hit the side of the car with a force that shook the entire vehicle. The sound was deafening, a metallic screech followed by a guttural thud. The car rocked violently, and I was thrown against the door. "Go! Just go!" Christy screamed, her voice almost drowned out by the pounding outside. I glanced back, instinct taking over, and for a split second I wished I hadn't. Illuminated by the faint red glow of the taillights was a figure that defied explanation. It was tall and hunched, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. The skin, if you could call it that, was mottled and gray, stretched taut over its grotesque frame. But it was the face, or what passed for one, that froze me in place. Its eyes burned red, more vivid than anything I'd ever seen, and its mouth hung open in a jagged tooth-lined maw. For a moment it just stood there, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying us. Then it moved, lunging forward. Mike didn't wait for a second attack. The car screeched into reverse, the tires struggling for traction on the dirt path. The creature fell back into the darkness, but I could still feel its presence, like a pressure on my chest. We sped down the hill, the headlights barely cutting through the oppressive blackness of the forest. Branches slapped against the windshield, and the car jolted as we hit every dip and rut in the road. It felt like the woods themselves were closing in on us, unwilling to let us leave. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, blending with the sound of the wind rushing past the car. They weren't coming from the forest anymore. They were inside, surrounding us, threading through the air like smoke. I gripped the edge of my seat, staring straight ahead, afraid that if I turned around, I'd see it again. Mike's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, muttering prayers under his breath. As we broke through the edge of the forest and hit the main road, the whispers faded, replaced by an almost deafening silence. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It followed us, clinging like a shadow we couldn't shake. I turned to look out the back window one last time. The road stretched out behind us, empty and dark, but I swore I saw movement at the edge of the trees. A flicker of red eyes before they disappeared into the night. Even as we sped away, putting miles between us and that cursed cabin, the weight of its presence stayed with me. It wasn't gone. It wasn't finished. And somehow, I knew it never would be. We didn't talk much during the drive back. The silence in the car was thick, heavier than the air in that cursed forest. Each of us stared out the windows, lost in our own thoughts, too shaken to even try to make sense of what had happened. When we got home, life didn't just go back to normal. Something had shifted in all of us. For a while, we stayed in touch, trying to act like we could forget. But the truth is, none of us could. Christy was the first to pull away. She moved to a city halfway across the country and stopped answering calls. The last time I spoke to her, she told me she hadn't slept through the night since the cabin. She mentioned hearing whispers, faint and distant, even in her apartment. After that, she refused to talk about it. Daniel didn't fare much better. He started having vivid nightmares, dreams of being chased through the forest by something he couldn't see but always felt. He told me once, in a rare moment of honesty, that he sometimes woke up with fresh scratches on his arms. Mike tried to pretend it didn't happen. He threw himself into work and avoided any mention of that weekend, but every now and then I catch him glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. And me? I tried to push it down, to convince myself it was all in my head, but late at night, when the world was quiet, I'd hear faint creaks in my house that made my chest tighten. Sometimes I'd dream about that forest, and when I woke, the smell of metal would cling to my nostrils. Years passed. We grew older, drifted apart, and I thought I'd finally put it behind me. Then one evening, while scrolling through an old news archive, I stumbled across an article about Jasper Ridge. It was brief, barely more than a paragraph, but the headline was enough to send a chill down my spine. Jasper Ridge abandoned after multiple unexplained disappearances. The article mentioned hikers who had vanished without a trace, their campsites left untouched, and locals who reported strange noises and sightings near the forest. The town had been evacuated, the government citing natural hazards as the reason, but I knew better. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Whatever had stalked us that weekend hadn't stopped. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and claiming its next victims. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, and I don't think I'll ever fully understand it. But I do know one thing. It left its mark on us, and on that place. A mark that won't fade, no matter how many years pass. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, where the air feels heavy, the silence presses down on you, and something just doesn't sit right, leave. Don't question it. Don't wait to see what's out there. Some things are better left undisturbed. And as for me, I can still see that footprint in my mind, clear as the day we found it. The evil footprint still lingers in the soil and in my mind.